Remember, we've just finished a war for independence, and the colonists have achieved their independence, and they will become the new United States and a new republic. So the Republican model is what they're hoping to build in their new society, so that power could be limited and shared especially by the people, so that new laws are made by the consent of the people. Right? And a republic was a new and ambitious project in this day and age. The only republic before the Americans built a new republic was the English, and the English republic was a round failure, I think, if you remember from an earlier lecture. So the English republic had failed. The Americans wanted to overthrow a tyrannical autocrat, as they saw it, King George III, and they had. So now they're going to create a republic, and once again, so that they might share power, and that power might be limited such that individuals and individual liberties were guaranteed. But there was no guarantee of success, so I've subtitled this "No Guarantee of Success." And this lecture is how we went from an Articles of Confederation already written in 1777, so 1 year into a war against Britain. The colonists have written a new Articles of Confederation, and which is a constitution that they functioned under until they will be inspired to write a new constitution, which is the one you have today. So we want to look at the conditions post-Revolutionary War, and then what made them rewrite and actually throw out and write a whole new constitution in this new and just forming republic. First off, you want to know that there's a new landscape, of course, after war. Wars always bring about, or post-war conditions are always a little bit different, because generally speaking, during war, there's a lot of economic prosperity because both sides are in the midst of arming their war machines, and so usually that brings a lot of jobs and a lot of prosperity. And after the war, there falls usually a little bit of a recession. So let's talk about especially the economic landscape. The new country had gained some lands as federal lands, the lands that had belonged to the crown originally, and also loyalists. So many of the loyalists went to Canada to escape any sort of persecution in this new United States, and so they confiscated lands that had belonged to loyalists previously. So the new government actually had a few lands in its own hands. Right? There was also a period of slowdown of the economy. There was a stagnation, which means, and the most important phenomenon was unemployment. So as the troops came back home, there was a lot of trouble finding jobs because the jobs obviously had been taken up by others, and the economy was in transition. There was a general inflation because the demand for goods went up. Once again, as the war effort petered out, the demand for ordinary goods, of course, expanded, and then that caused inflation. So the colonists, or the former colonists, at this time had to deal with a stagnating economy and inflationary conditions at the same time. This would make it very hard on a middle class, and that's the key to it. But nonetheless, they were in a new age, right? A new landscape where the world was open to them in a way it hadn't been under the imperial system. So there was increased economic freedom if they could get their resources together to start to trade on a global scale, and they would start to do that. But of course, an economy needs time to transition to that sort of a economic stance. So they were seeking new markets, part of it would be in Asia, although you still have to know that the bulk of their trade went to Europe. But nonetheless, they could seek markets of different sorts to some extent, maybe in the Latin Americas, especially after they revolt from Spain. There was competition on a global scale, and then even in the colonies themselves, so growing competition. These would eventually put pressure on prices down. And finally, they were able to start, or they would be starting manufacturing in the New England region, and that would become signature to the New England region. So the New England ports both manufactured and traded on a global scale. So they built commercial interests and they built manufacturing interests in the New England, and then too in the middle colonies. All right, remember too that their state assemblies had all had written constitutions, so they weren't new at constitution writing, that they had had a whole history of limiting powers through constitutions and then instituting still a rule of law. And so that's a very fine line, right, to keep the government's power limited so that individuals can be free and yet not allow so much freedom that it is lawless. So those were the two goals of their constitutions at the state level and in their state assemblies. So most of them had a Bill of Rights, and that had been a tradition from Britain for over 100 years. They tended to want to keep the executive very weak, and many of them had strong legislatures. Well, they all had strong legislatures, but many of them had two houses, bicameral legislatures. And that will be important because when we get to the Constitution and the new writing, they will create two houses. The original Articles of Confederation had only one house legislature. And they all had property requirements, so you couldn't be a completely poor or a person without any property and participate in voting anyways. You'd always be a citizen and have citizen protections of the laws, but you couldn't vote. So there was a property qualification for voting in these state assemblies. Finally, just an example of two state assemblies. Virginia, of course, is a good one because they will show up with a plan for the new Constitution that will be modeled on their own state assembly. They had a Declaration of Rights, which is like a Bill of Rights, intended to protect individuals from the government. And that is a method, or that is a way that you can limit the government's power, right? And they had a strong and bicameral legislature. So Virginia's plan when they show up will be for a bicameral legislature and give most of the power to the legislature, which is obvious as it is because the legislature writes the laws. So any body in government that writes laws is usually the most powerful. Pennsylvania, just to give a contrast, so you can see Virginia had a relatively conservative constitutional state constitution. Pennsylvania, just to give you an example, had a very radical democracy for a constitution. And I'm just going to describe it to you here. They had a single unicameral house, so they had only one house in their assembly and in their legislature. And it was elected yearly, and they elected the president, or the head of the chief executive, yearly in Pennsylvania. Most government offices couldn't be held more than 2 to 3 years, and any male 21 years and older that was a freeman could vote, so there was no property qualification. And in Pennsylvania, there was, at least at first, no laws against blacks or any sort of other Jewish citizens, etc., from voting. So Pennsylvania had a pretty wide open constitution originally. So I give you those two examples so that you can see the poles, right? A very conservative constitutional government in Virginia and a very radical democratic government in Pennsylvania. And these states would come together and they're going to try to create a new constitution. So that's sort of a little bit of the background. What was wrong with the Articles of Confederation? John Dickinson is the main author of the Article of the Confederation, and the Articles of Confederation left border problems. That would be the western border of the states, how far these states would go out, and then also territories. How do you incorporate them into the United States as states themselves? So they would have to solve those problems. But the Articles of Confederation did not have a solution for that. They left to the government the very few responsibilities, and here they are, right? They had, of course, the responsibility of foreign affairs. So in other words, they had sent out diplomats to act as representatives for the United States and to deal with foreign governments, and that was pretty obvious. They also provided postal service. There was no executive in the Articles of Confederation. There was a unicameral House, and there was no judicial. They left all legal execution and judgment, adjudication of laws to the states, right? So the executive was absent. There was no judicial at the federal level. And they allowed the states to build the court systems. So this Articles of Confederation had a lot of weaknesses. They only had a legislature. So if you think about it, your new Constitution has the executive, judicial, and the legislature. And this Article of Confederation, they were so worried about someone trying to accumulate power around themselves that they gave power to almost nobody, and they gave very little power to the federal government. And then it would be faced with a crisis, and that's what we're going to look at in just a bit. So let's just sum up, right? They left to the states, right, taxation. So the federal government under the Articles of Confederation could not tax. The states taxed. They left building of armies to the states. So that once again, the federal government could not build an army, and that's what will be problematic. And they left to the states their own regulation of trade. The weaknesses then are all of those things, right? They didn't have the ability, the federal government did not have the ability to build a treasury, build money to tax and to finance itself, basically. Interstate commerce remained unregulated. So that's the problem with that is that it's very difficult to trade between states. I mean, what are the laws? Are there going to be any sort of customs, charged by interstate trade, etc., right? It's better to have the federal government responsible for state-to-state trade, because then they can standardize it, and then it makes commerce much more easy. So that's why that's important, right? You want smooth-flowing commerce. You want people to easily move between states in your United States. And then finally, there's no army, and this is what will be the biggest problem ultimately in the end, because they're going to get a rebellion in Massachusetts, and it's known as Shays' Rebellion. So Massachusetts has some very, very poor farmers on its very western edges, and they were suffering from stagnating economy, inflationary prices, and the fact that many of them were veterans from the military and hadn't been paid wages for their military service. So they were a little bit angry about being in this country that they had fought for and being subject to the laws of bankruptcy and unpaid debts, etc., and then not having been paid by the government. So they got together and they decided that they were going to rebel, and they armed themselves. They attacked an armory in Springfield, it's Springfield, Connecticut today, but they attacked and took over an armory, and then the states had to get militias together to fight them, and so that was scary for the federal government, because the federal government couldn't do anything. They didn't have an army. So Shays' rebellion made it clear that the federal government didn't have the ability to stop a rebellion, to defend, right, the United States against these kinds of things. All right, so there was war debt for the United States once the war was over, to France, a little bit to Spain as well, and those are their foreign loans, Spain and France, and they owed wages, back wages, to these veterans, right? As I said, there was a stagnating economy, and currency was scarce. At this time, I mean, during the war, they had a continental currency, as they called it, which they used, which was not of much value after the war was over. But the state, the way that you get currency is a bank issues notes, and then they keep a reserve to back up those notes if somebody comes in and says, I want the gold that this note represents. Today you guys have $1, $5, $10, $20 bills, right? Technically they represent amount of gold you could get from the bank, although you can't really do that today. Your currency is stabilized by the stability of your government, basically, today. But in this day and age, a bank would issue a note, and it would be its own private. So they had small banks, basically, everywhere. And a bank would issue notes, and then they would use the reserves to loan people money, etc. But this meant that currency was scarce because the amount of notes in circulation corresponded directly with how stable or how the economy was working at the time, and they had a stagnating economy, so it was pretty difficult for a bank. They were a little bit reserved to issue notes to people. They didn't have a whole lot of reserves, and so currency was scarce, right? So I'm not sure if that explains it well to you, but understand that a bank gives out guarantees, and those are called notes, and they would look like a lot of different things, but your $1, $5, $10, $20 basically is the same thing today. And that had to be backed up at independent bank level, and that was it. So they didn't have, like you guys have, a federal government that has the ability to, with many restrictions on it, obviously, to print these notes for you to use in the economy. So this day and age they didn't. A bank would respond to the economic situation of the time, and if it was a stagnating economy, they would retract on the amount of notes. So currency was scarce after the war was over. States were still imposing taxes. So these Western Massachusetts followers of Shay still had taxes to pay to the state, and they were poor. So these Shay's followers were poor farmers who were in debt, and many of them were veterans who hadn't been paid by the federal government. So you can kind of see the conundrum. They weren't paid by the government, so the government owed them a debt, and yet they were being threatened with debtor's prison if they couldn't pay their own taxes. So it's pretty understandable why they would up and join together, claim an arsenal at Springfield, and try to execute a revolt against the Massachusetts government. And that was another thing. The Massachusetts government was centered in Boston at this time. And you will find, if you go look at the capital of Massachusetts today. It's actually Concord, which is pretty much directly in the middle. And the reason for that is this Shays Rebellion. So let's look at what the demands of the Shayites, as they're called, were. And then you can see what their problems were by the very demands that they make, right? They wanted a paper currency to be made available. And I just want to put one note on that paper currency. When we get a constitution, they're going to try to build a U.S. bank so they have the ability to at least affect paper currency. And so, but you can see that would help these poorer people to have a paper currency and more money in the system, so that it would help to alleviate some of the slow economy. Paper money is like a lubricant for the economy, and it really can help to get things going. And they understood that back then, so they wanted a paper currency. They wanted tax relief, of course. They wanted debt relief. They wanted an end to debtor's prison, right? So you can see all these problems by these poor farmers in western Massachusetts, right? We haven't been paid. We're in debt. We've got the state on our back for taxes, and we've got the threat of debtor's prison if we don't come up with the money, right? So, and finally, they wanted the state capital to be moved to the interior. And then that's where we get Concord, Massachusetts, as the capital of Massachusetts today. And it is about dead in the middle. And these guys, the reason for that is if they wanted to participate in the town hall, which is what Boston still did, and have an effect on state politics and laws that are written, they needed to have access to the government, the capital of Boston. And so the state capital was moved to the interior following this. Now this was, it was lawless, because they took over an arsenal, threatened the state with warfare, basically, or rebellion. So all this uproar, this is mobocracy, these people, and it was really, these people think that they can alter the way politics goes, alter the Constitution, and do things lawlessly. So there was an outcry of that after this, or during this Shays Rebellion. The states had to build militias to stop the Shayites, and they did, right? So eventually the Shayites were stopped, and everybody, or many people, saw this as a need for a stronger central government, so that the federal government could have done something to help out this situation. All right, so they called for a stronger government, and Shays Rebellion was the spark for that, and they called a constitutional convention. And then the big question was, how are we going to make a stronger federal government so that it has a military, basically, and it could handle small rebellions Now, just so you know, not everybody was excited about this Continental Convention. Patrick Henry, whose speech you read, Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death, said that he smelled a rat with this Constitutional Convention, because they were clearly going to, they said at first they were going to amend the Articles of Confederation, but they would quickly throw it out and build a whole new constitution. And so Patrick Henry was kind of right in a way. He said he smelled a rat. It sounded like they were going to go do one thing, and they end up doing another. And that one thing was they were supposed to amend the Articles of Confederation, not completely rewrite. 55 delegates show up from all the states, so everybody was represented there, and it went on. It was a closed-door affair. So if we value transparency in our government, this was one thing that wasn't transparent, I think, is the important thing about this Constitutional Convention. And finally, they sought merely a simple majority to change the Constitution, change the Articles of Confederation to the new Constitution you would have. Now that wouldn't be the end of things because it had to be ratified by the states, but nonetheless, to get it written and to get it ready to go required only a simple majority. Now I'm going to tell you, in this Constitutional Convention they had, of course, lots of disputes over what was going to be in this new Constitution, but I'm going to talk to you about the major changes and the major crafting of the new Constitution. So the first thing is how the government was going to look at a basic level. Now people showed up, the states showed up, and they showed up with their own plans. Now the plan that they took ultimately was the Virginia plan, so I'm going to talk about the Virginia plan. I think your book also talks about the New Jersey plan, or it should, because that was important in the Great Compromise. But anyways, the Virginia plan was the one that was in its essential design adopted. And so what was that essential design? That the government be divided between three bodies, and that there were checks and balances on each of the branches of government, right? You have in your readings Federalist Paper 51, it really sort of explains the idea of checks and balances in the new Constitution. But basically, you had to have each branch of government, the executive, the judicial, and the legislature, with its own power, independent power, but with the ability to check other branches of government. And so they were trying to write a constitution that provided for those checks on each other. They then understood that the most powerful branch is the legislature because it's the law writing branch. So they made it bicameral. And the idea of checks and balances is bicameral means two houses. So you have a Senate and a House of Representatives. And that the Senate then is intended to check the House of Representatives and vice versa. All right, so the Virginia plan was adopted, and that's its essence. Three bodies, checks and balances, and a bicameral legislature. Now they had to decide on the legislature how voting would go. And they made what was called the Great Compromise, and especially between the large and the small states. Because if you think of voting, you probably think, well, wouldn't they just do it by population? So each man's vote was weighted equally. And that's true, except if you look at it, they had some very small states, and those states wouldn't have very much power in the government if they did it that way. So they made a compromise, right? The upper house would have equal representatives for each state, and that meant two. So your Senate has two representatives for every state, and the lower house then would be represented by population. And originally the lower house was the place where laws could be proposed for the Constitution. Anyways, bills could be initiated into the constitutional process in the lower house, and so that was probably the most powerful place in the original Constitution. Finally, if you look at that, the lower house will be represented by population, so the issue of how to count slaves in the population was very important. If you count slaves as one in the population, then that would mean the slave states would have more representatives in the House of Representatives, or the lower house. If you counted slaves as zero, they would get less representation in the House of Representatives. So that's what's at issue. How many representatives would the southern states have in the House of Representatives? And so the Southerners wanted their slaves counted as one, and many of the Northerners wanted slaves not counted at all in the population. So they compromised, and they call it the 3/5 compromise. So a slave would count in population as 3/5. 3/5 of a person. So if you have 500 slaves, you get in your population statistics for voting 300 slaves would be counted at that time. So that meant that, well, that was their compromise. So South got some representation increase because they had slaves, but not completely all the way up to where they counted slaves as one person in the population. All right? It was all about representation in the population, though. So I have students who think, wow, they didn't think, it was a commentary on the slaves' humanity. It didn't have anything to do with that. Think about it. The Southerners were wanting them to be counted as one in the population, were hardly treating them with great human concerns, right? So don't think of it that way. It was really a discussion about how many representatives Southern states would have in the House of Representatives, okay, in the lower house. All right, the 10th Amendment was added. So the 9 amendments are going to be added. I'm going to talk about that in a second, right? But the 10th Amendment is very important in the Constitution, and that left all powers to the states that were not explicitly given to the federal government in the Constitution. And that 10th Amendment has been argued over for 200 and almost 50 years now. Okay, so that's a very important amendment that will be added to the Constitution along with the first 9 amendments, which are all about individual rights. All right, so they created the Constitution. And those were the main debates that were had, the main things that determined the nature of the Constitution. And then they had to get it ratified by all the states. So people who considered themselves Federalists and supporters of the Constitution would argue for the benefits of the Constitution. So some of those people were Alexander Hamilton, for one, James Madison, and John Jay. And they were big advocates for the Constitution and went out and tried to get it ratified by these states, and especially in New York. And so they wrote what were called the Federalist Papers. And the Federalist Papers, and there's over 80 of them, are articles written for New York newspapers. And they were intended to convince the New York population to ratify the Constitution, and the vote was very close in New York. You have in your reader of primary sources 2 of those Federalist Papers, number 10 and number 51. And they're probably 2 of the most well-known Federalist Papers. Now, Federalist Paper number 10 argues how the new Constitution would prevent a tyranny of a majority faction. And you're going to be expected to read that. And it's very important that you look at and try to figure out his argument for why the Constitution, especially with its state and federal organization, helps to mitigate or reduce the possibility that the majority will tyrannize over a minority of people, right? That's number 10. And number 51 is a lot easier to understand and read because it's all about checks and balances. So the authors, Madison and Hamilton of 51, are discussing how the different branches of government have their own will and what checks they would have on other branches of government. Okay? All right, those were the Federalists and the Federalist Papers, right? The supporters of the Constitution. There were people who did not support the Constitution. I don't think I have to tell you, Patrick Henry was one of them, and smelling a rat. Excuse me. All right, what they saw was that this new Constitution with its stronger federal government, they were like Patrick Henry, I smell a rat, but they saw it as the possibility of tyranny, that somebody in the government might be able to get too much power, that a strong federal government would favor the well-born because they would be the ones that would have the time and the energy and the ability to influence at the federal level. They also thought that if the federal government was able to tax, it would weaken the states, and the federal government would use excise tax, putting taxes on one particular item originally to raise money for itself. But the Anti-Federalists said, oh, this is going to weaken the states. It would threaten or abolish individual liberties, this Constitution. And think of the Constitution without the first 10 amendments. That's what they're talking about. So individual liberties weren't included in the whole thing. So all the arguments of the Anti-Federalists against the Constitution were the reason for the adding of a Bill of Rights, or the first actually 9 amendments, and then 10, of course, with the state, the 10th Amendment, where the states have all the power that is not explicitly given to the federal government. So this Bill of Rights was added because of the Anti-Federalist campaign against the Constitution. So that the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists, it's important to just see from the get-go how the U.S. politics worked, right? That there were people who were very strongly in support of this new strong federal, and then there was the opposite opinion, and the dissenters who were able to have a voice as well. And that voice of dissent, these Anti-Federalists were responsible for guaranteeing rights to individuals in the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Right, so that's how the Constitution was written, and that is some of the first things that, or the first changes in this new republic, right? They changed the entire Constitution, and it was a bit of a fight, and perhaps it was necessary. I don't know. Shays' Rebellion made it look like there was something needed to be done about the very, very weak government under the Articles of Confederation. All right, that's it. And we'll turn to the first 2 administrations, Washington and Adams, in our next lecture.